Welcome to the Growth Perspective Podcast. I'm your host, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Kristen Eccleston. How you doing today, Dr. Eccleston?
I'm doing really well, King. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. It's been some time since we've done the show, so I'm
Yeah.
excited to be back doing the show.
Yeah, COVID COVID hit me hard there for a while, so that was my fault for that. So I apologize to everyone and to you for that factor, but gladly we're all doing well now and we're back at it.
Well, definitely no apologies necessary. I mean, that's something that we have to deal with. I'm just glad that you were able and your family were able to just get on the other side of it and you're back feeling healthy. It's great to see your face and your smile again. So,
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
what's our topic today that we're going to be discussing on today's show?
So I had a little topic that I wanted us to talk about. I feel like I'm a little behind the times because it was really big maybe about a month ago, but I still thought it was something to kind of look at from a growth perspective. But it's the topic of Lizzo. So about a month or two ago, she had gotten, I guess, I don't want to even say hot water because I don't think she did anything bad, but she had released a song that had the word spaz in it. And you and I both know here in the States, the word spaz, usually you think of somebody who's just kind of like maybe acting a little crazy or doing something a little funky. That's what the word spaz means. But I guess in some other countries, the word spaz can be taken offensively. It can mean some negative connotations towards somebody who has some disorders that are going on. And a fan had pointed this out to her and essentially said to her, "I'm really offended that you have used this word spaz. This is what this word means, and it's actually a very hurtful word." And Lizzo immediately came back to the fan and was like, "I am so sorry. As an African American female who has gone through a lot of trials and tribulations in my life, it is never my intention to ever make anybody feel bad. I will remedy this immediately." And she did. She went back into the recording studio and she re-released the song, re-recorded it using a completely different word and removed it, which I thought was really gracious of her because most of the time you don't even see artists respond at all. Maybe you get an apology from their PR person, but the fact that she went through all this effort to go into the recording studio, which I imagine was probably at her cost to do, and re-record it so that she did not offend. And it was something that she didn't do intentionally. She didn't know it was offensive. She didn't recognize it was offensive. And as soon as she found out, she fixes it. But this became a huge news thing because there were people who still attacked her and came after her after the fact. "Oh, you should have known better. Oh, this is horrible of you. I've lost respect for you. I can't listen to your music anymore." And just attacked her, which I thought was ridiculous because Trevor Noah, who has a show, of people who are familiar with him, he kind of touched on this too, is in this country, right? When people make mistakes, we typically want them to go, "I'm so sorry. I made a mistake. It was not my intention. And now I'm going to fix it." But yet, we still attack people even when they make honest mistakes. So, what is to stop people who make honest mistakes from remedying them if you feel like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't? And that's kind of the topic I thought we could talk about today, kind of leading in based off this Lizzo incident is what happens in a growth mindset when, and because in my opinion Lizzo had a growth mindset. She made a mistake that she didn't know, it was not malicious, it was, she did not intend to. She immediately fixed it, apologized, put it out there that she was apologizing, fixed her mistake, but then she was still attacked for it. And so what does that mean? How do we overcome that and start to give maybe a little bit more forgiveness to people, especially when they go about it the way that she did? Because I could see you maybe attacking somebody if they went, "Oh, well, too bad, so sad, I don't care." But that was not the scenario that happened. So I was hoping that maybe we could go down that rabbit hole a little bit today.
Well, yeah, definitely, definitely. And I have my own personal take on it in the context that I believe that, again, being a person who's Generation X and growing up where things were said were a lot much more harmful, hurtful, and there was no apology,
Mhm.
that become thick skinned. And I think that, and in our era, and this could be definitely a question for you. I don't have any kids, and I've often had this conversation with friends of mine and clients of mine who have kids, that people, I believe, make the mistake of wanting to make the world a better place for their kids as opposed to making having given them more opportunities.
Mhm.
Because when you make it better, you end up making them a little bit softer in the context. They don't go through the same struggles, the same pain points, the same challenges that kind of build your character. And as a result, like to me, for someone to get offended by a word that was used out of ignorance, and then you're gonna double down for someone to say, "Well, I'm really offended. You shouldn't say this word," when that wasn't even meant that way. Especially when you got cultural differences in
Mhm.
countries where that word may, like you said, in the United States, it means something totally different. So I can see
Mhm.
if it was one core universally agreed upon definition, and she used that word maliciously, then yes, folks can attack her and they'd be justified. But for someone like you said, spaz, that's something you say you're spazzing out, meaning you're not being mentally clear, you're not being present with us, you're acting a little different right now. And that's a
Mhm.
common word that's used in many of Americans' vocabularies. So for
Mhm.
someone to attack her from outside the country without taking that understanding into consideration, to me, the other words where I'm going with this is that is more about now trying to deal with you can't please everybody, and if you try to please everybody, it doesn't work. And the scenario that you laid out with Lizzo shows proof that she tried to please these individuals,
Mhm.
and it still didn't work. Some people are still going to be, because in other words, what I've learned, if a folks, and see, this is where I really have grown in my growth as a growth mindset. We talk about the growth perspective. I've learned that to be offended is a choice. It's not just an automatic response. In other words,
Mhm.
it's not you choose to be offended. Like I can somebody can come up and say everybody in this room is stupid. If I'm in
Mhm.
a room full of people, and I can choose to be offended by that statement, or I can choose not to be. And so well, I'm not stupid, so he's not talking about me, and that could be my mentality and move on. And so where I'm going with this is that I think people need to just realize, for me, the engineer in me always comes down to this scenario: is there value in that decision? If I don't see any value in being offended at that time, then I'm not going to be offended at the time and give that person that power to offend me. So that's kind of how I look at it. That's my perspective on it.
Actually, King, I'm glad you said what you did because it's actually one of my favorite psychological perspectives to talk about is and you're right. You can only get offended if you allow yourself to get offended. So let's talk about from a psychological standpoint how that occurs. And I'm going to give you an example and then I'll kind of go down that rabbit hole a little bit. I'm sure if you've ever been somebody who was this fictional person, right? And you've always kind of had this this self-confidence issue that maybe you're a little like you feel like you're stupid. Like maybe you feel like you're not that smart. Maybe you've tried to mask it and you don't want people to realize it, but you've had people tell you that. And so you have this sensitivity to feeling that way already. So then when somebody says to you, you're stupid, you would immediately get offended. You immediately internalize it because you already have had that doubt or those feelings inside your mind that make you feel that way. So that's why it's so upsetting when somebody says it to you. Now, on the flip side, if you're someone who is very strong and like, I'm an intelligent person, I know that I'm smart, I know what I'm capable of. I've never even once ever felt like I wasn't an intelligent person. And you have that same person say, you're stupid, then you go, this wackadoodle has no idea what they're talking about because I am not. I'm incredibly smart. I'm incredibly intelligent. And then it doesn't even phase you what that person said to you because in your mind, you know that you disagree with them. There's nothing in the back of your mind at all that makes you feel like you're stupid. So that person has no idea what they're talking about. So oftentimes when somebody says something to us that gets us upset or makes us feel upset, it's because we are already internally struggling with that thought. We have already had our worst self-critic inside of us be relaying that message or had us feel that message or somebody in our lifetime has said something to us that has just continued to kind of gnaw in the back of our brains, and so you're right. It really can only upset you if you allow it. But what allows it to upset you is because you're already having that thought. You're already having that feeling. You're already struggling with that self-belief that you're not whatever it is that the person says to you. And that's that psychological thing that I find really interesting. So if you get offended by what somebody says to you, you really should look a little, not that that person should be allowed to say offensive things. They shouldn't. We should all be respectful and loving to each other, but you've got to look inwards a little bit as to why did this impact me the way that it did? What am I already internally struggling with that makes me feel like that person's words had this much power over me? Because that is really what is happening. We are already internally struggling with whatever concept or idea has been said to us. And that is why it has provoked that level of emotion from us. So I'm glad that you brought that up because that to me is a really powerful thing. And it can actually show you where you are still struggling or what you are internally dealing with that you need to work on overcoming so that people's words don't have power over you.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that's why I really love this topic today because as you and I explore this within this growth perspective podcast, I think that the world now is becoming to the point where everyone is so thin-skinned
Mhm.
and everyone is so willing to attack someone for being offended because everyone is choosing to be offended nowadays,
Mhm.
as opposed to sitting around, to your point, saying that I'm not going to let the power of that word bother me. And one of the biggest things that I've wrestled with is really holding back my perspective on this cancel culture because the next step is to cancel someone. Say, well,
Mhm.
this person, like I said, I'm not gonna buy your records anymore. And that may be a choice, but then to go out here and advocate that other folks don't buy this person's records because you were offended to me is wrong. Now you can come out and say, I'm not gonna personally buy it unless you have that choice, and I have no issue with that. But when you start to preach and then you start to champion other folks should not buy this record because this person said something that was offensive,
Mhm.
and again, the person's intention wasn't offensive. So I think that that's one of the biggest things that I wrestle with. Like, for example, even as we begin to still build relationships in our country among multiple different races, whether you're black, whether you're white, or you're male, or whether you're female, there's going to be some ignorance there as you begin to start to deal with the other individual, where you may say something out of ignorance, not intentionally, but just out of ignorance of a cultural bias that you grew up with. And if a person that you're talking to doesn't really know you well enough and they take
Mhm.
offense to that, that's where the issue lies. So I think that communication now should be where we look for, again, and the engineering me is always looking for what's the best solution. So I think that as we talk about the growth perspective and the growth mindset, that's what I advocate for individuals is to take a moment and ask yourself, what is the best scenario? What's the best decision for me to make in this scenario that would not only benefit me, but benefit the entire situation? And if it is to be offended, what do I have to gain by being offended in this context? Now, as you say, if Lizzo had doubled down and said, well, first of all, it's my music. I can say what I want to say,
Mhm.
and I'm going to stick by that. Then I can understand the attack. So now, with that being said, let me ask you this question: how does a person who is thin-skinned begin to recognize that within themselves? Because it's easy for someone like me to say, yeah, you're being thin skinned. And I've heard folks say that about certain black people, about certain words that come out. And they'll say, well, this person, you've been too thin skinned. I was just joking. So,
Mhm.
how do you know when you're being, if you can self recognize that you're being too thin skinned in a scenario?
That's a really good question. And I think there are some people who will say that you're being too thin-skinned when in reality you have the right to be upset. Somebody has said something. So I think the first thing you have to reflect on is, was it the person's intention to be malicious? Was it the person, like, were they, and then they go, "Oh, I'm just joking," because a lot of times people will say things, "Oh, I'm just joking." But was it the person's intention to be malicious? Was it a mean thing that they said and they knowingly knew they were saying a mean thing and then they try to take it back? Or was it a scenario like Lizzo's where there was no malicious intent behind what they said. It was an honest mistake, if you can even consider it a mistake.
Right.
And 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 then you've gotten offended, because that's where you have to separate if you're thin skinned. There are people who say mean and malicious things and then try to gaslight you. I'm sure you've heard, gaslighting is a big thing, like, and put it on you. And then there are people who say things that it was not malicious. And I think that's where you have to start. Was it of a malicious intent, or was it not of a malicious intent? Now, if it was a malicious intent, and it's obvious that it was, and then the person tried to play it off or laugh it off or put it on you, that, oh, you're thin skinned, then I think then you need to look at that's that person and they have stuff to work through. But if it was coming from somebody who was not a malicious intent, maybe it was a racial thing, it was a cultural thing, and it really was just their lack of knowledge and not something that they were doing to be malicious, then that's where I think you have to say, it's do I have am I getting upset, or do I look at it as an opportunity for growth for myself and for this person? Because
Mm.
I very much so, I were to say something that was culturally inappropriate, I want to be corrected. And saying to me, hey, you may not have realized, but actually what you just said could have been taken this way. And I definitely would have been the immediate person who's like, "Oh my god, I'm so sorry," because it's never my intention to hurt anybody's feelings, but I'm glad I now know, because I want to do that again. But I think in that circumstances, I understand why that person could have been upset, but instead of making it where they have thin skin, use it as an opportunity to kind of, teach me or teach that person, "Hey, are you aware of this?" Now, if I go, "Yeah, I am aware of it," and I said what I said, then you're entitled to feel the way that you felt, because I was being an ignorant asshole, pardon my language. But if I was like, "Oh my god, I am so sorry," then I think you need to reflect that. Don't get offended, don't get mean, don't get ugly. It doesn't need to be ugly. This is an opportunity for you to knowledge, for you to create a better understanding between people. And so that's where I would say you have to look at, do you have a thin skin? Is information that's coming into you, is it coming from a malicious place, or is it not coming from a malicious place? And then you have to determine from there, am I being too sensitive about it? And then how am I handling the situation? By means, if the person is being malicious, get as upset and stand your ground and say your boundaries as much as you need to, because that person obviously didn't respect your boundaries and felt like they could say those things to you. But if it was coming from a place like in the Lizzo scenario, where it was just truly an honest mistake and was not ill intended in any ways, then use that as an opportunity to say, "Hey, I'm going to let you know so that you're aware of this." And then depending on how that person responds to that information, you can determine if you want to continue to communicate or not communicate with that person, because now it's on that person to either say, "I'm so sorry," or if they get belligerent or whatever, because they're putting up their defense walls because they were wrong. Well, that's kind of their personality, and you have to determine if you want to deal with that or not. But I think that's where you have to look at it. And you hit a couple times too on, you talked about youth and you talked about this thin skin. And I want to go back. There's this book. It's called Nation of Wimps. And the author is slipping my mind right now, but it's called Nation of Wimps. And it's actually a really interesting book, because it talks about how we have started to develop this nation of wimps by trying to be very sensitive about things. And with our eighth place trophies and our everybody's a winner mentality, right? And all these different things. And what is happening is, they talk about how the generation of parents right now is one of the first generations that is really in tune with how they felt as a kid, those kind of disappointing feelings that you felt as a kid, or those sad feelings that you felt, and how this generation of parent is really trying to make it so that their children don't have to feel those feelings. It's like they're trying to protect their children from those feelings of disappointment. But what is happening, which is coming from this place of good intention with these parents, is these kids are eventually getting to high school, college level, and then all of a sudden they realize, "I'm not number 1. I'm not the best. I'm not the whatever." And then these suicidal ideations come up in these children, and it's because they have no perseverance or resiliency skills. And so this is kind of two different topics, but I think they're very, very similar in relation to one another. That we create some of these thin-skinned children because we're trying to protect them from some of the hurt of the world, which I get because I am a parent. And when your children hurt, you hurt. And so sometimes maybe you're trying to relieve your hurt and you're trying to relieve your children's hurt, but at what cost? So maybe you temporarily relieve or protect your child from something, but in the long run, is it worth it if they're not functional adults because they don't have that thicker skin or they don't have resiliency skills or they don't have the ability to persevere because they lived their whole life thinking that they were this wonderful entity who never had to have any kind of disappointment in their life, and now all of a sudden in adulthood when your parents aren't there to protect you and you're going to face disappointment in your life. I mean, it's inevitable and it's not always a negative thing. You've got to have the bad to feel the good. But these kids can't function because they've never had to persevere or be resilient. And I see this all the time in my work too, where parents, it's very obvious that they want to protect their kid, but they've actually created a monster in the sense of doing so because this kid is just the one who is in control. The parents have lost control. The kid is calling all the shots. And it really started, I think, with the parent wanting to protect the child. But now the child has no perseverance, no resiliency, and their parents don't make them have to push through or feel uncomfortable because the parent doesn't want them to have to feel that feeling. And it's actually doing now a major disservice to the kid and to the parent now that the child is older.
Yes, yes. And see, that's where I was alluding to. I mean, I can go back and I remember, and I know this is kind of slightly different, but to that point, I remember when I was growing up, we used to ride bicycles and skateboards, and we had no padding, we had no helmets, we had nothing. You just go out there and you fall, and you get scraped up, and you get hurt, and you get band-aids, and you may break a limb. But that was just part of childhood, and that was accepted as a part of growth in childhood. I
Mhm.
remember riding a bicycle and slammed on the brakes going down a hill, and I flew off the bike, and I landed, and my teeth, my mouth was open, and my face literally scraped the ground, and I chipped my tooth. To this day, still, my tooth is chipped from
All
that
the teeth are
experience.
fake too, King, from a bicycle accident. All these teeth are fake right here. Mhm.
And you see, so it didn't end your world, right? Now, again, I still question whether or not, and I don't ride bikes on a regular basis, but I always said if I rode a bike, it would feel awkward to wear a helmet. But I know it's a law now; you have to wear a
Mhm.
helmet, right? But I'm just going back to the point where I think that that's the problem I'm starting to see in our country right now, where to course correct something that was wrong, we go all the way to the opposite extreme, and that's not better
Yeah.
either, right? So now we live in a society where no one wants to offend. So when you do offend, the consequences to cancel. The consequence is to ridicule this person
Mhm.
and make this person uh, and not look at this person as being someone who is human, who has made a mistake, and who's trying to atone for their mistake. Because again, in the last 40 years, we've gone through a complete paradigm shift as far as what's considered to be acceptable as far as our culture compared to what was not acceptable in the past. And a lot of people act like they don't understand that we've gone through that shift. Like, I mean, we still
Yeah.
20 years, I would say, within our society, really accepting individuals of being gay, where, that you're not
Mhm.
being ridiculed for coming out of the closet. Where when I was a kid coming up, that was something you did not do. So even if somebody
Yeah.
was gay, you definitely didn't come out and say it because you would be ridiculed, and society chastised the individual for coming out of the closet. And I'm just saying that that's where I think that if we are going to come together now, especially from a diversity standpoint, we have to take into consideration of the cultural biases and the cultural norms that folks grew up with. And
Mhm.
then
Mhm.
are that is that person you're talking to willing to say, okay, I understand that's offensive. Let me learn from this experience and let me build from it. Because that's the only way we can really grow, you know. And if a person is not willing to, make that change, then you're right. That's a person you want to push out of your network, get out of your life, or whatever the case may be. But as a connector, as a person is whose business is to build relationships among diverse thoughts. Because again, I'm connecting with individuals from around the world. And the only thing we really have in common is the fact that we seek a higher purpose and our principles are more in line. But for me, I feel better connected to that individual, to be honest, than the
Mhm.
person who may be the exact same skin color that I am, the same gender that I am, and live in the same city that I live in. It's like, yeah, we physically have these
Mhm.
things in common, but mentally, we're so far different that we can't even have a conversation. And so I'm saying all that to say is
Absolutely.
that the first step to building these diverse conversations and these and have I'm sorry, building these diverse relationships and having these diverse conversations is not being thin skinned. It's allowing yourself to be a little offended and then learn from it. And ask yourself, to your point you mentioned earlier, what is the person's intent behind the statement they're making? But then again, I'll wrap it up by saying this: that for me, everything comes down to energy. I truly believe, as Einstein said, that everything is energy. Energy is everything. And I'm not going to give someone the power to offend me.
Mhm.
Because to me, I truly, and I reiterate this, I truly see no value at all in giving you power to offend me, regardless of what your words that you may say. It's like, because again, if I set my day, I wake up and say, I'm at a 10. I'm gonna operate this very positive perspective because this is what benefits me psychologically, emotionally, physically. This is where I want to be, and I go through this day. And if you give people power to say, the first person I interact with, he comes out of his mouth and says something that's offensive, or she says something that's offensive, and they just now I've given them power over my day. And so my question for you is, by being thin skinned in that context, doesn't that do something to you psychologically where you grow up to the point where you don't try as hard, or you may not persevere through certain obstacles or situations that come along your way?
I think it does so many things. I think everything that you just said, but I also think if you are allowing somebody to constantly have power over you, then you're losing your own personal power. And you talk about energy, and I think then you're letting people essentially be energy leeches off of you.
Mm, mm,
Because you're losing that energy. If you're putting your mind power towards being so upset and letting somebody have this power over you, then essentially you're losing some of your energy. And I think there were some people who, again, there is the right to be offended or to be upset if it was done in a malicious way. But again, it goes back to what we initially talked about at the start of our conversation is I think it's a really good time to reflect too. If you were getting so offended by what the person is saying to you, then that really means that there is a level of unhealed trauma within yourself. And what I'm hearing you say, King, is that you've got that in control, which is fantastic because not a lot of people do. That you aren't going to lend people power. You're not going to give your energy away. You feel you know who you are. You own yourself, which is a very important thing, is what we should all inspire to do. That I own myself because truly when you get offended or you get upset, it's because you are actually psychologically battling with something within yourself. That person just happened to be the catalyst of it. And that's a really good time to reflect. So I'm going to go back to my stupid example just because I feel like that's a very easy one to kind of lean on, but if somebody says something that alludes to you being stupid and you take offense to it, that's a time for you to really reflect when or where in my life was that said to me? And how has that lingered with me? And I'll give you a personal example to kind of help emphasize the point is I was a female with ADHD who went undiagnosed until they were 30. And so most of my life, I really did feel like I was stupid. Like I felt like I'm trying to hide the fact that like I don't think I'm as smart as my peers, when in reality I was actually a very intelligent person. But if you had told me if I could travel back in time to my high school self and say, "Hey, you're gonna have a doctorate. You're gonna have it in brain science. You're gonna have it from Johns Hopkins University." High school me would have thought, like, "What are you smoking? Like, I don't know where you just came from, lady, but I don't think this is the case." And but it was because those were messages that I was getting from being an undiagnosed female with ADHD, and my brain processed information differently, and it didn't fit into a one size fits all box. And so I was getting these subconscious and conscious messages from teachers and peers that something was wrong with me when in reality, my brain just worked differently. So, but when somebody said something that questioned my intelligence, I got really upset about it and it did offend me. But it was because I was already internally struggling with that idea or that concept because it was something that I felt. I wasn't sure what I was doing with it. And so the point that I'm trying to make is if you get really upset by what somebody says to you, that means there is something in there that you have to explore. And that's what I had to do. I had to explore that thought. Okay, I'm not. Here's all the reasons why I'm not. Here's what I can actually achieve. Here's what I can do. And now, if somebody were to say that to me, I wouldn't get offended at all because I know in my core that that is not true about myself, that this person is just running their mouth now. And what they're saying does not accurately reflect who I know that I am. So when you are getting offended, that is your time to start reflecting and understanding what button is this pushing? Maybe it was from my childhood. Maybe it was from my young adulthood. Maybe it was even last week. But what button is this pushing? Because it's obviously pushing a button that I already have as something that I've got to work through, that I have to realize that this is upsetting me in some case. And in order to get to that point where you're at, where I'm not going to lend that person this power, you've got to resolve whatever that inner thing is that's bothering you. And that sometimes that's therapy, sometimes that's inner work, sometimes it's meditation, or sometimes it's just getting to the root cause of where was the first time I felt this feeling? Can I think back in my mind to the first time I experienced this? And maybe it was on a playground with, Tommy and Sarah, and they said something, and you go, boom, that's why I feel this way. It's stuck with me ever since. And then you kind of work your way through it and resolve that issue so that the next time somebody says this thing, it doesn't hold the power over you. But I would really recommend to anyone who gets really offended by any particular thing to kind of dive inwards and try to figure out where is the root cause of this feeling and what work needs to be done to heal it. So I'm not lending this type of energy and power to the people who are obviously saying either ignorant, malicious things to me, or get to the point where if somebody says something and it's not from a malicious intent, I can go, hey, I just want to let you know that actually, where I come from or culturally or in my life, this is what this really means or what I experience. And I just want to make you aware of it. But I feel like if you're getting offended, even when you're trying to teach, then that person is never going to hear you. I think we both know if somebody's coming at you, even with good intent, you're immediately going to put your walls up. So if you want to teach that person or say, hey, I just want to make you aware, it's got to come from a place of being genuine as well, or that person is just going to not hear the message because their walls are going to go up.
Absolutely, absolutely. And going back to the whole Lizzo situation, it's funny how different people see things differently and be offended differently as well. Like,
Mhm.
for example, I had this conversation with a woman who happens to be a black woman, and she mentioned the fact that her interpretation of that was that they were coming after Lizzo and Beyonce because they're strong black women, so they want to cancel them. And so that's how she took that. And it was interesting to hear her perspective on it. Now, I didn't necessarily agree with that perspective because to me, I felt that it was more like, well, to be honest, Lizzo and definitely Beyonce are bigger than just black women. They're influencers. So
Mhm.
I think it's more of an influencer thing than a color thing in that context. That's how I took it. Well, her being a black woman and her being somewhat thin skinned on that. So anything that comes at another black woman, she tends to be defensive about.
But I
And
can
so,
understand that, right? I
wh-
mean, if you based
yeah,
on what I just said, I can completely understand why.
right. And I can understand it as well. But this is where I'm going with this is that
Mhm.
even though we understand it, but it's not healthy to be that way. Because see, now you're allowing that's something, and going back to my favorite book, Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, Stephen R. Covey talks about circle of influence and circle of concern. So this is not even in your circle of influence, but it's your circle of concern. So now you letting someone who attacks Beyonce and Lizzo, who are totally on a different level than you are. Yeah, they may say share the same skin color, but they're a whole different level. They're influencers, and
Mhm.
you've been offended for them. And see, for me, then now your day is ruined. So now you're changing your energy. You're in different conversations with people. You doubling down on your perspective on that, which takes away from me your creative energy, which you could be doing something totally different. that could
Mhm.
be positive, that could be productive, that could be beneficial to your life or lives of others. But instead, you're spending your energy debating this issue, trying to prove how you feel this potential, and it may even be a conspiracy. But the
Mhm.
question begins, they can't take these individuals down. I mean,
Mhm.
they can literally, but what I'm saying is to the point where it's not going to change your life either way. And that's where
Right.
I'm going with this. If they were to bring Beyonce Lizzo down, then how that's going to personally impact your life at the end of the day. And that's why I think that most people should stop for a moment and really think through, is it in my best interest to let myself go, as you talked about earlier, go down this rabbit hole, be offended, and now I have all this negative energy around uh, people like this, and now I'm scouring the internet because I think a lot of people watch YouTube videos for that purpose, so they can
Mhm.
scour through the comments to be offended, to find someone saying something that offends them, and they jump right at it, and it's like that to me is where I think that people just really don't utilize the creative energy that we're born with to stay on something positive. That's kind of the direction I'm going in with that.
Well, I actually call that, and I think we might have talked about this before, but I call it, in my mind, there might even be an actual theory out there, but I call it the Pretty Woman theory. And in the movie Pretty Woman, there's a scene where Julia Robert and Richard Gere are laying in bed, and she's talking about some of the negative things that have happened in her life. And he's saying, "Well, why did you believe these things?" She goes, "Well, the negative is just easier to believe." And that is actually how our brain, it as animals, I mean, we are advanced animals essentially, and that is how our brain is wired. That's why there's so much sensationalism in the media. That's why all, you know how you only hear negative things in the media? Like, where are the positive stories that we know they're happening, but we only hear the negative? Because it's the negative that brings us in. Our brain is wired naturally for survival aspects to be more in tune with the negative. It's the concept of, somebody could say 100 nice things to you, and then you have that one person who says that mean negative thing, and then you kind of get fixated on that, even though you had 100 other nice things said to you. And it's because survival instinct wise, your brain was wired to remember the negative things more, because if you went to the watering hole and there was a jaguar there that could have killed you, your brain needs to remember that, because that's how you're going to survive. That's how you're not going to get eaten, is for those negative things to stand out more in your mind. But we no longer are in a lifestyle situation, right, where we have to worry about going to the watering hole and is this jaguar going to eat me today? But our brain has not evolved to kind of catch up with that factor. We have a more advanced thinking system, but we still have that middle brain, that animal brain that exists, that still makes that negative piece stand out to us. So I think oftentimes what happens is people get so hung up on going down the rabbit hole of internet or stories or media sensationalism that is all negative, because that is what our brain is attracted to, because of that survival aspect that is still hardwired in us. And the problem is, now that we have internet and social media and more access to more knowledge than we've ever had in the history of humankind, is we can now get fixated on it. And I think a lot of that is why you're seeing such significant rises in mental health issues and different things that are going on in our country. I mean, we know we have a youth mental health crisis. The White House has even acknowledged that as of late July. We know mental health has been significantly bad since the pandemic, but it had been prior to the pandemic too. I think that just exacerbated it. But really, what the issue is we have access to now allow ourselves to just keep feeding ourselves negative information, and we essentially become addicted to it. But it's because our brain wants to have it, because it wants to survive. But we don't actually need to have that information. But that's where our brain can't make that distinguish. That's our brain can't say, "Hold on, I don't need to know this." It's just it keeps searching, and it's like it goes down this rabbit hole of negative information, because that's how it's hardwired to do. And now we're left with this issue. So if your question to me is how do we get out of that? That is a great question, King. The second I can come up with that answer, maybe that's when I'll, make it big. But I mean, that is a big issue for us as humans, is we're addicted to these negative messages, but it's because that is how we are wired for survival.
You know, as you say that we're wired for survival, and I definitely get that, and of course I understand, and and accept that. But going back to, and I was having this conversation with someone earlier, I, and I've shared this with you before. I have these 8 characteristics that I look for in an individual before I connect with them. One of those characteristics is the growth, being growth minded. And we talk about on the show the growth perspective. See, this is why I really advocate, and I'm saying this, that having an individual that has that characteristic to me is far more important than looking for an individual who may be of the same race, gender, religious background, ethnicity, political, whatever it may be that you want to connect with, but they're not growth minded.
Mhm.
You can't build with this individual because they're going to be fixated on what they believe, what they know, and you're not going to be able to change them. And I've seen it across the board. And whether it's a romantic relationship, I'm trying to build with somebody, and they're not growth minded, and they're not trying to grow beyond what they're. A good friend of mine that you was on a show of ours, the Fully Human Connections podcast, Reggie talks about in his book the cultural givens. That
Mhm.
when you grow up, you have these cultural givens that you're born with, and that without a growth mindset, you never go beyond that. And I see people are still stuck with those cultural givens of how they see the world and how they operate and how they manipulate and how they move. I should say manipulate, but how they move. I just want to bring this to a close by saying there's a quote by Muhammad Ali that says, "A man who thinks the same at 50 that he thought at 20 just wasted 30 years of his life." And see, to me, that is really going back to that growth mindset. If you're not doing something on a daily basis to grow your mind, as you talked about before, I understand why, as you said, our brains are hardwired to think negative. And I remember when I first came to Baltimore with the invention of the smartphones and all these news sites, and I was signing up for all these news notifications. That I
Mhm.
realized that everything I was receiving was negative.
Yep.
Person shot here, gunshots here. This person. It was like there was never something that ever came across saying elderly woman porch rebuilt by community of individuals because her life mattered. Right?
Mhm.
I never got that notification. It's always gunshots, violence, death, 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 drug overdose. And I was like, I realized that if I keep letting myself get these notifications and I keep filling my mind, as Joel Osteen talks about, I have to have a vacancy, no vacancies uh, banner. So to repel that kind of negative information, and that's where I'm going with this, is that
Mhm.
I want to repel as much negative information as I can, as much negative people as I can, because again, it's all energy, and I want to repel all negative energy.
Oh, I agree. I think the actor's name is John Krasinski. He was on The Office, and he's been in a bunch of different things, but during the
Yeah.
pandemic, he had a little podcast, and all he would do is negative news. Like, I'm not sorry, not negative news. Positive news. Opposite. We're talking about negative here. Positive news, and it was really cute. Like, you could write into him or message him from all over the country, and he had like a little news hour, but it was only positive messages about things that people were doing during the pandemic to help their neighbors in general, and it was so beautiful. And I want to say I read or watched something one time that the news media knows what I just explained about the whole negativity hardwire in your brain. They know that, and they play off of that because that's what brings in ratings, right?
Mm.
Because we're addicted to the negativity, and that's what makes the ratings higher. And so it's actually a tactic that's used. But what I don't think people realize is how much it's actually impacting our mental health and is contributing to this mental health crisis that we have. And so why it would be important for us to have these positive messages, for all the negative things that are happening in this world, there are a lot of beautiful things that are happening too that we don't give attention to. So what do you think it would be like if we did start to give some attention to that and some more onus to that? Like, maybe that would be the answer to saving some of our mental health, to to maybe helping to rewire our brains, but we're essentially giving into this wiring, and people are using that to their advantage for ratings and for essentially negative aspects of what they're trying to achieve. And it's really sad because I'm with you that we shouldn't just focus on those things. But I think that's going to take beyond you and me at this point in time to try and get. And I'm willing to be part of that movement because I do think having some of these positive things are going to need to be what takes place in order for us to get out of this mindset of lack or this mindset of negativity and start to promote some of the beautiful things that are happening in this world.
Absolutely. And so let me ask you this question, because I'm a person who's an advocate behind the importance and necessity of building what I call connectionally intelligent tribes. See, my way of dealing with it is just really to connect with folks you align with based on your principles, based on your purpose in life, and exclude everyone else. Like I'm beyond. And so my question is,
Yeah.
am I wrong for having this mentality where I'm saying I'm done trying to put forth the energy and trying to change someone else? It's like either you're already in line with my principles and purpose in life, or you're not. And if you're not, then you're like a pothole to me. I'm going to avoid you and go a different direction or go around you. And if you
Mhm.
are, I want to build with you, because just at this stage where I'm in my 50s, I know I'm on the other side of, I have shorter amount of time left on this earth than I did previously. And so within that mindset or within that paradigm, I want to stay focused on building with positive minded, focused individuals, regardless of their race, sexual orientation, gender, politics, doesn't matter. If they're in line with my principles and passion, then we can co-create. Let's build. Let's look at how we can make the world a better place. So my question is, am I wrong for having that kind of stance?
I don't think that you're wrong. The way I see it is you have created healthy boundaries for yourself. It sounds like to me in the past, you maybe have tried to extend those olive branches, or you have tried to take people who were not as flexible in their thinking. And then it sounds like, and I don't know, but it sounds like maybe you've been burned or you've had bad experiences with that. And so through that, you've learned that I'm not going to put my energy and my time there because it has not given me back what I was hoping to achieve from that. So I've created my boundaries and this is where I'm going to put my focus. And I don't see that as a negative thing. You are protecting your energy, you're protecting your mental health by creating your boundaries. And what I how I see it, at least and this is my opinion, is you've created these healthy boundaries where you have continued to talk to people. But my hope is that maybe somebody who doesn't align or maybe doesn't think the same way as you are is still listening to your messages because they have a growth mindset and they go, well, let me think. Like, I'll give you an example. I'm really big into the Adnan Syed case, and I'm sure being from Baltimore, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
I
And I
do.
was listening to the Nancy Grace podcast, and I listened to it, and I realized she was taking a really negative perspective towards it. And I'm all about I personally think he is innocent, and I was glad to see the vacation of his conviction last week. And I started to listen to her podcast, and I was like, this is really negative. But instead of turning it off, I was like, I'm going to listen to it because I want to hear the other perspective, not just this perspective I've been seeking out that is aligned with my thinking. I want to hear the other side. So I'm hoping that maybe somebody who isn't aligned is still listening to your messages and to your thoughts because they're going to go, ah, I hadn't thought of it. They're looking for that aha, and maybe they'll still gain that aha. So you've created a boundary to protect yourself, but you're still out there. You're putting, I mean, podcasts like this, your other podcasts, you're still putting yourself out there, and hopefully there are other people out there who are willing to listen and look for those aha moments so that you're still making those impacts on people who may not naturally be aligned with your way of thinking. And maybe that is starting to expand their mindset or give them a new perspective or way of thinking. I will say Nancy Grace did not change my mind by any means. I still stand very strongly with my thoughts, but I still wanted to have the opportunity to go, I hadn't thought of it from this perspective and not just seek out people who are going to feed my thoughts, because to me that's also a healthy thing. You should seek out listening to people who are not naturally aligned with you, because all that you're doing is then feeding your own perspectives and it's just reinforcing yourself and not giving you the opportunity for the aha moments. I had somebody say to me the other day that they were really impressed by the way I didn't get upset or argumentative when I was disagreeing with someone. And I said, because I don't see disagreeing as a negative thing. Everyone thinks disagreeing is negative. It doesn't have to be negative. Like, I think it's okay to disagree with people. It's just how you go about disagreeing with people. You don't have to be nasty because you disagree. I actually get a lot out of having conversations with people who do not necessarily align with my way of thinking because, again, I'm looking for a perspective that I maybe not have had before or have thought of in that way before to help shape and grow my mind. But to answer your question, I think you have created healthy boundaries. You are very open to hearing people's opinions and thoughts, and hopefully other people are willing to listen to yours and allow for that growth mindset.
Yes, and I think that. Well, thank you for saying that because the other day I was watching an episode of the Jeffersons, which the Jeffersons originated from All in the Family, and I watched the episode of All in the Family, and it was funny.
Hmm.
Again, now I wasn't offended by what Archie was saying, and Archie is known to be a bigot. The whole show was about him being a bigot,
Hmm.
but it was funny because he was a dumb bigot, and you laugh at him because he was ignorant and some
Hmm.
of the things he said. But where I'm going with this is that, see, we used to be able to laugh at that kind of humor, where in today's society, his show wouldn't even last one episode
Yeah.
because people will be so offended by it, and it's like, where did we get to the point where we can learn from the ignorance. See, even Archie got to the point where he was beginning to grow a little bit, and it showed growth there.
Hmm.
And certain topics never would have came up had it not been for that show. And then other shows that came as a result that had a huge influence on me and my childhood as I grew up. And I grew up understanding that in my society, in my neighborhood, I've been called every name by my so-called friends that you can think of. I mean, if someone had a handicapped sister, she was nothing was off limits. So you had to grow up with that kind of thick skin, and you
Yeah.
begin to tolerate that, and you realize that at the end of the day, that you can't take anything personal, which was one of my favorite books, The Four Agreements of not taking anything personal. That's one of the first agreements that you deal with, and I didn't realize how much power is within that. It's easy to say it than it is to do it because we're already, as you say, wired to take things personal, even though it may not be personal, especially when someone directly calls your name and says, you're such and such.
Yeah.
But where I'm going with this is just that the freeing that it gives you when you don't have this thick skin. I mean, when you have thick skin, you're free and you're
Hmm.
able to move a lot better. And like I said, to me, at the end of the day, to your point about mental health, I think that, again, I don't have the degrees and training that you have, but just in a simpler context, that one of the ways to kind of deal with mental health is just have a positive mental attitude.
Yeah.
And if you can at least frame that and keep that, then that can at least be a barrier against, just like eating healthy, drinking water, exercising can be a barrier against other diseases coming. It's not going to stop them, but it at least gives you some form of a barrier of protection, I believe.
I I agree, and as you're sitting here talking, I'm thinking about how all the different kind of concepts we talked about today, they really kind of mesh together. And I think what's happening in society is you have a lot of people who felt the negative feelings of, whatever mean things were said to them. And, there was a time in society where people could get away with saying it. And it didn't feel good to hear these negative messages sent to you. And they remember these feelings and they don't want other people to have those feelings. And by trying to protect everybody else, now we've become overly sensitive. Now you almost can't say anything. And me, who even is not somebody who is trying to offend anybody, because I'm very much like, I don't want anybody to feel bad about themselves. That's not my intent. I even get really nervous to say things because I'm always like anxious. Am I going to say the wrong thing? Have I offended somebody? Am I gonna, and you've created this almost, now I almost feel like communication is breaking down even
Mm.
because you're afraid to say things, or you're afraid to communicate, or you're afraid to because there's people where if you, even like Lizzo, you make an honest mistake and you go, I am so sorry, I truly didn't mean it, you still get dumped on. You still then have people who take this as an opportunity to bring up things that I think you shared this, the female that you had been talking to, like bring up race issues and other like things that didn't even have anything to do with the initial issue now get dragged into it. And I think it's so sad that like you can't even make a mistake, an honest mistake that had no malicious intent behind it, without people still attacking you and then turning it into other things and bringing in other ugly things that had nothing to do with the original situation. And I think it actually is hurting communication because now people are afraid to talk or are afraid to say
Mhm.
things, and people who honestly didn't mean things from a malicious place because they're so afraid of being attacked or brought down. And I think if anything, that's going to just create more communication barriers amongst ourselves, and all these things that we're trying to ease, disabilities, race tensions, sexual orientation tensions are only going to get worse if people are afraid to say things and be wrong and learn from it. But but they're just going to be attacked and brought down anyways for making an honest mistake.
Absolutely, absolutely. As we get near the top of the hour, just want to get any kind of closing thoughts you might want to leave our listening audience with, how they can really grow their growth perspective.
I'm going to circle back to what we said and say, really, when stuff like opportunities or situations like this occur, really take a minute to recognize, is this coming from a malicious place or is this coming from just a lack of knowledge? And then really go forward with, if it's malicious, then you know that this person is dealing with their own stuff. Um, and it is what it is, and it's not worth your energy and time. But if it's really not coming from a place of ill intent, if it was just coming from an honest mistake like Lizzo or the person who says whatever they say, take that as an opportunity to really make it a more meaningful communication connection, and share with that person from a place of, of understanding and love, like, hey, I want to let you know. And it doesn't need to escalate beyond that. That would be my one thing that I ask of and leave with everyone.
Well, I'm gonna quote the great rapper LL. He said this, and he was a huge influence in my life. He says, "Any comment, any comment is a compliment." And that's how I feel. That someone has if someone's willing to put you in their minds and create the mental energy in their minds about you, then to me that's a compliment, and I'm going to say thank you. So, regardless of what the reason may be, I detach myself from the reason why you're thinking about me. The fact is that you are, and I wasn't thinking about you at all. So I'm thankful that you are thinking about me, and I'm going to move on with my day and feel as though I'm having some kind of impact in the world if I have people having thoughts about me in any way, shape, form, or fashion.
Absolutely. I like it.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Eccleston, for joining today and co-hosting the Growth Perspective. Hopefully, listening audience, you got something out of this conversation, that it's healthier to have a growth perspective and look for ways to grow your perspective on life, love, all those things that you may have a fixed mindset right now. So that's a message I want to leave with everybody as well.
Absolutely.
So again, Dr. Eccleston, thank you for your investment of time, energy. Listening
Thank
audience,
you.
thank you all for listening to the Growth Perspective. And until we have the next show, everyone, look for ways to grow your perspective. Thank you.